Okay, so what I'm going to focus on is the work we've been doing within NCRECE in trying to unpack implementation of the coaching condition. As Jason described, we developed and we tested 2 interventions, but I'm going to really focus on the coaching intervention and talk about a series of studies we've done to try to understand this deeply. Like everybody's work in the room up here, lots and lots of people have helped create this work, and so I'm really privileged to be able to talk about what we're finding and what we're trying to unpack here. Both my authors that are up here, as well as some other people back at home, some in the room, who've done lots of work to try to help us understand this work. And so just to recap what Jason shared earlier about our main NCRECE findings is that we are having some success in creating interventions that can positively change teacher-child interactions, and that we have some evidence that we can replicate at a greater scale, but we're still seeing some variability in that seems pretty important to try to unpack and understand. And it's important for us to try to understand about this implementation because it really gives us a sense of where we should be concentrating our resources. So what we want to think about is how and why these things are working so we can use that to concentrate our resources going forward. So what I'm going to address in this presentation are 3 research projects we've undertaken to try to answer some of these questions. And part of what I'm going to present are looking at how can we understand the quality of the coaching delivery and its associations with the implementation. What we're also going to look at is different types of dosages and how that relates and is associated with change in teacher practice. And then last, I'm going to talk about some work we're doing right now of trying to better unpack the fidelity that we saw that even though Jason showed that during our study we had really high levels of fidelity, we still saw variation that we thought was important, and we're trying to unpack that better. So as Jason described, MTP involves this idea of a coaching cycle in which the teacher and the coach together decide what they're going to focus on in terms of their teaching practice. And the teacher tapes their practice, and then they send it to the coach, who then takes that information and edits the footage and writes prompts to help the teacher focus in very specific ways on their practice. That gets posted to a server where the teacher can go on and then has an opportunity to look at the videotape, to respond to the prompt by the coach, and to analyze their own practice. And then the coach and the teacher talk together about that practice and about how teacher-child interactions are playing out in the classroom. And then following that, the coach and the teacher decide together what they're going to focus on next, and then the coach directs the teacher to specific elements on the website that will help that teacher improve their practice. So what I like to share that is because you see that there's multiple places where we have opportunity to kind of script things out and set things in motion, but that there's also room for accommodating and individualizing, and that provides some variability where we're able to understand maybe some differences that are happening that may be important to teacher practice. But as Bob said earlier, it's complicated to try to unpack all this stuff. As a matter of fact, that's one of my favorite sayings. I keep thinking we should get like bumper stickers or T-shirts about our work. That it's complicated. There's a lot going on within interventions, and so we need to have a systematic approach to trying to unpack it so we can begin to kind of compartmentalize pieces and make progress. And so there's been quite a few reviews out there looking at the impacts of implementation and to direct outcomes. And so in this case, what we're able to do is begin to think about how can we separate inside this intervention what we're interested in and what we have impact on to look at how that relates to outcomes. And for us, that means within the MTP coaching cycle, we're able to pull apart what is about the coach and what the coach is doing and what the teacher is doing. And in these cases, our common outcome is always about teaching practice. How are we able to unpack this to understand the impacts on teaching practice? And as I shared with the cycle, there's lots of information in there about teachers, about the coach's ability to follow the model and to implement well. But what we also see is that there's a lot of variability for teachers to be able to complete a certain amount of cycles, be engaged or not via their work with the coach, to be able to go on the web use, and their skill in analyzing their own practice. So these 3 studies are going to try to take that apart. So in our first look at implementation, we were interested in kind of at a global level, can we understand these 3 pieces together? So can we look at the association between, in this case, the teacher report of the coaching quality and how that relates to what they actually do within the intervention, and does what they do within the intervention actually relate to the change in instructional support? When we look at these individual variables, what we see is that on average that teachers were reporting pretty high levels of coach quality, that in general they saw it was a pretty positive thing, so a 3.5 out of a 4, but that there is some variability there that might be worth exploring. What we also heard, and Jason reported this earlier, is on average we saw teachers completing about 10 coaching cycles, but again some variability there. And we also saw variability in what the coaches were reporting about teachers' active engagement within the coaching cycles. And last, we saw teachers really varying in how much they were using their website. Some teachers never went to the website. Some teachers, on average, were using it about 13 minutes a month. And some used it for over an hour a month. So we have this full range of them accessing the resources that we think may lead to change. Okay, so what did we find? So what we were looking at first is, does what the teacher thinks about the quality of the coaching relate to what they do in the intervention? In all cases here, what we saw are positive associations. So for teachers who thought that the coaching quality was good, we saw them engaging in more cycles, so completing more coaching cycles. They were more active participants with the coach, and that they were using the website more often. When we looked then, does this relate to change in practice? What we found was that the more cycles that teachers completed, the more positive change they had in instructional support. Additionally, the more engaged they were with the consultant, we also saw positive changes in instructional support. We didn't see the same association with the web use. So even though teachers who saw the experience as positive were using the website more, that was not a direct, at least in this model, leading to change in instructional practice. So what we're taking from this first study is that what teachers are experiencing, their direct experience with the coach, mattered for their engagement in the intervention, and that engagement mattered for change in instructional support. But when we started looking at the cycles a little more, as Jason described, the coaching process is manualized. So we suggested to coaches that you start with certain focus and move on to other aspects within instructional, move from emotional support to classroom organization to instructional support, that to try to systematize them moving that way. And so what you see here is that at cycle 1, 100% of teachers received a dose of emotional support. But then as cycles went on, teachers began to experience different things within the intervention. What you recall too is that within the cycle, there's 3 prompts. So coaches had the opportunity to actually focus on different aspects of teaching practice too. So that a cycle, they may have agreed together that we're going to focus on classroom organization, for example. But once the teacher sent the tape in, there might be an aspect in that taping that might be really important to focus on, like a teacher sensitivity. So that there was some flexibility of being able to point out maybe a strength or a struggle and mix it up a little bit. So what this does then is create a really different range of dosage in terms of prompts and specific prompts focused on teaching practice. And what this gets at is part of what Marty was describing is this alignment then. We can then think about, well, does this particular dose of emotional support or classroom organization or instructional support line up with those exact changes in teaching practice? Or do we see maybe potentially different patterns based on what teachers are focused on? We're able to test the same kind of idea with the web use. That the web use, the teachers were directed to certain places, they really had the opportunity to look at whatever they wanted to on the website. So again, we could look at our specific exposure to emotional support elements on the website, classroom organization, instructional supports. Do those align? How do those align with teacher practice? And because we have really smart people on our team, we're able to look at this stuff in really kind of complicated ways. And so instead of just asking, does more of something contribute to positive change in teacher practice, we're able to look at, as at some point, there's some diminishing returns. That the curve goes up with certain dosage, but then starts to level off, so that there's a maximum amount of dosage that we don't need to go beyond. But the opposite is true, that the patterns in the data could suggest a minimum amount of dosage needed before you start to see positive change. So when we look here, so what you see on the left-hand side are emotional support, classroom organization, instructional support, positive changes in teaching practice. And what you're looking at here is the dosage of the prompt focus on that specific practice. So what I'd like to draw your attention to are a couple things here. One is what we're seeing in this data is that there's evidence for the maximum idea, so that there's positive associations and change in teacher practice of the focus, but then it starts to level off at a certain part of the dose, okay? And what you see is some alignment here with classroom organization prompt focus and positive change in classroom organization, and positive associations of instructional support prompt focus and instructional support change. And that what you're seeing is that when teachers were focused on classroom organizational prompts, that they had positive changes in classroom organization, but then it began to level off at around 5 prompt focus. The same is true with instructional supports. But what you also see is that there's this spillover effect of focus on instructional support prompts. And that for teachers who had high levels of instructional support prompt focus, that you see positive change in emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support. Further, what you see is that the leveling off for change in instructional support doesn't start happening to almost 15 prompts, so that it takes a higher dose of instructionally supportive prompt focus before the curve starts to level off. What you see is a little bit different pattern with the web use. So in this case, what we're seeing is the minimum curve, or the curve going the other way, in that you need a minimum dosage of exposure to the website before you start to see positive changes. So similar to what the prompt story was, in that there is some alignment with the prompt or the web use focus and the change in teacher practice. So in this case, you need to see about 15 minutes of exposure to the emotional support part of the web use library before you start to see positive changes in emotional support. But again, you see this carryover into classroom organization, and that you get positive changes associated with classroom organization when a teacher has been on the website for about 16 minutes. So what we take from that is that we're seeing dosage matter, very specific dosage matter, both in alignment to the practices, so focusing specific elements of the intervention is leading to specific changes in teacher practice, but also a spillover in that it's affecting other areas of their practice too. And last, I just want to spend couple minutes, because Leslie's telling me my time's almost up, on some new work we're doing to try to better understand what the coaches are doing within the intervention that potentially may be leading to teachers' improved analysis of practice. What we found was that within the study, when we were providing feedback to coaches on what they were doing and how they were prompting teachers, that they were able to get the fidelity checks. They were doing the things that we said do, but there was still variability in how well they seemed to be doing it. So we've developed a new coding scheme to try to go back and unpack those, that written work, which is part of what's great about doing a web-mediated intervention, is that you have lots and lots of data you can go back and look at, and eventually be able to unpack this further to be able to look at, are there differences that then we can associate with change in teaching practice. So just to give you an example here, here's an example of a well-written prompt that we think about breaking into 3 pieces that are key active, what we think is the active ingredients of the coaching process. So the first is that the coach identifies what they're going to focus on and provides really sort of common language in describing what it is that they're going to talk about in terms of what dimension. And then the coach directs the teacher to watch the video for a very specific type of behavior that they're describing and what they're seeing in the video. So look at this clip where you're showing the child, they share a quote of what they're saying. And then the last part, from the fidelity perspective, what the coach is supposed to do is ask some question that gets the teacher thinking about their practice. And here is where we really saw some differences of coaches' ability to write really strong questions that push teachers to look at their impact that they're having on the kids and look at their own practice to really set up the conversation they're going to have that delves deeper into their practice. So what we've done so far is take 3 cycles of all of our teachers and coaches exchanges and code all of those. So this is like hot off the presses data that we have just started running. And it's just to show you quickly, the light blue bar is the overall at this point, and the dark blue bar is one coach, and the gray bar is the second coach. So what we're seeing is that still we're seeing that overall fidelity is pretty good. So that even now we're sort of stretched out that it's not just ratings of did they do it or not, but how well did they do it. We're still seeing coaches do a pretty good job of the elements we described. Where we see the bigger difference is in that cognitive challenge of how the coaches are pushing the teachers to think about impacts on kids. And what you're seeing is that the teachers' analysis of practice, both in the mean levels but also in correlations, are a reflection of that. So how hard the coach is able to push is resulting in teachers' equal ability to analyze their own practice. Since we think that may be a key mechanism that leads to them being actually to change their practice, it seems like we're tapping into something important here that's happening within. So just to really quickly summarize, what we're finding is that in examining implementation, it's really important to pay attention to the variability both at the coach level and at the teacher level, and that what teachers think about the intervention is pretty important to pay attention to, is it's associated with what they do in the intervention. So thinking about what are the things we're doing to help teachers get excited, interested, and see value in this endeavor they're going into first is really critical. What we're also seeing is that as we look at this dosage, we really want to pay attention to this tightly aligned aspect of it. What are we really pushing on, and is the output aligned with that, but also the spillover effects, and can we have bigger bang for our buck in some areas if we focus on one thing, that there's a carryover to other areas. And last, we need to just continue to unpack what's happening in the coach-teacher exchanges. In our future work, we're actually taping some of the coaching sessions to try to see what those back and forth exchanges look like. And then also just, we're still living in our sort of inside of our MTP Coaching Cycle world, but to really think about going broader too, and then thinking about what is the context that these teachers are working in and the environments that they're working in that support this work going forward. So, thank you.